welcome. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about your group projects in terms of the parallel curriculum model and giving some feedback on the discussion and talking a little bit about the videos that you have coming up. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about the videos. The videos tend to be very stressful for a lot of people. Please try to not stress out. If something goes wrong, just reflect on it in your reflection and address what happened that was unexpected. The biggest problem that I often see in the videos is actually the technology component. So think about how you're going to organize the technology and then how you're going to get the video from the device that you're using. The best way to do this, I think, is by uploading it to YouTube. They tend to have a big enough storage for your videos, and then you can make it, I would prefer if you made it unlisted, and that just means that no one who doesn't have the exact web address can get to it. And so it makes it almost private. You would have to have the email address or the actual web address to find it. So that's my suggestion. And then as soon as I watch it and give you feedback, you can delete it. And then here on the information section in Blackboard, I have some YouTube sharing hints. And then here is the email. If you have to make it private, here is the email that is most useful for me. If you're giving permission to someone, give permission to this email. So that way I'll have a separate little email for the permission for the videos. If you have any questions about the videos, please feel free to email me. I know that it's stressful and it's coming up, but just take a breath and remember that you have that reflection component in there for a reason, so that you can look back and think about things that maybe didn't go quite as planned, or things that you would do differently in the future. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in action. There's been so many good ideas and so much discussion within the class this semester that I feel confident that it's going to go well. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the parallel curriculum model and take a look at some of your examples. So first we see here, this is from Team 1, and they're doing the science fiction unit, and they made a lot of changes to their stage 3 in their lesson plans, which I appreciated how they addressed my concerns. If your group didn't do that this time, I understand I got my feedback back a little bit later this week. You can submit it next week as well, if you didn't think through that this week. Your parallel curriculum model, in general, I want to say that I was pleased with the application of the parallel curriculum model, and I really enjoyed the discussions. I have them all right here. Basically, some of my comments are just in terms of adding a little bit more detail. So here, and a lot of people mentioned this in the discussion board, how the core curriculum really matched the overarching concept or the big ideas, and that is completely true. And so what I liked about how Team 1 did this was they gave the overarching example, and then they gave the specifics below, which was really helpful to me. The curriculum of connections, making a connection, and they gave an example of a near connection, and you can do near or far, so I wanted to make that comment here. And then here in the curriculum of practice, they were assuming the role of a science fiction writer, and so they were writing a piece much in the same nature as Ray Bradbury wrote his short story. And so I thought that was a good example of the curriculum of practice. But then down here they talked a little bit about cybernetics, and that's the scientific study of how people, animals, and machines control and communicate information, which is a fascinating connection here. What I would do is, if that's going to be part of the practice piece, what do, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to say this correctly, but what do cyberneticists do? What kind of questions do they consider? How do they operate? What kind of experiments do they run? And one thing I do want to mention that I noticed in a lot of the discussion boards was, oh, this curriculum of practice is good for secondary students, but it may not be that good for elementary students. But what I want to challenge you to consider is, what does a cyberneticist or scientist or author do that you could make developmentally appropriate for your younger students? So maybe they design experiments. So is it possible to design an experiment that maybe is not completely authentic for the field but would be authentic for your students. And so I encourage you to think about what kind of process skills these people use and see if you can apply it in a much simpler problem. So for example, if they're studying how people and animals and machines control communication or how they communicate, maybe you could design a small study on communication and think about how people use words to communicate ideas or how people communicate in terms of answering a question. There's a lot of smaller studies that could be done that would put the student in the role of a scientist, but they're not actually contributing information to further the field. So they're discovering perhaps information that already exists, but that's okay because they're assuming that role. They're becoming a practitioner, like a practicing professional, and that's okay. So that's one thing I'd like to just encourage you to think about. And then also here in the curriculum of identity, I think one of the things that we tend to do is, the students will reflect upon this, and I think that's probably one of the downfalls of the parallel curriculum model is just that it doesn't have as many pieces as understanding by design, which is both downfall and benefit. But here, if you just say the students will reflect, I want to know how they're going to reflect. So there are a lot of different types of reflection questions you could ask. So when you're turning in your individual unit, I want to know specifically what questions are you going to ask that's going to really address this curriculum of identity. So maybe, are you going to ask the students to reflect on their ability to become science fiction writers? What about writing this science fiction piece appealed to you? Where do you need to grow? Do you think you might be a science fiction writer in the future? Some of those types of questions would really encourage that reflection component and reflection of self. So how do I fit into the field? And I do agree that there's a lot of room for reflection, but I don't want to just know that they are going to reflect. I want to know how they're going to reflect. What questions are going to prompt that reflection? Okay, here's Team 2's work, and they did a nice job. They have so many examples here, so you can I'm just going to scroll through real briefly to show you all the examples that they have. So obviously, they worked really hard at creating this and creating their examples. They did a nice job also of touching on their overarching concept here, and this first part may just be like this big idea, but then down here they do give examples of how they're talking about that concept of relationships, which is what I was looking for. So in your individual units, if you just have this, what I'm going to write back is what are your details? Where do you see this? And they do have that below. Then for the connections, they are talking about the relationships of organisms and environments and connecting how things have changed over time. And so once again, I'm going to say, I see how this connects, and I typically am able to see how you have provided examples of connections, practice, and identity. But the thing that I'm concerned about is when you say something like that, I want to see how it's going to be applied in the classroom. So are you going to ask students to make those connections? Are you going to give them one organism and one environment and ask them to compare it to another organism in another environment? And they give more examples below, but I just want to give this advice for people who are working on their individual units. And then here for practice, performance task, acting like an ecologist and developing biomes. And I started wondering, is that what ecologists do? So do ecologists develop biomes? And is there a way we could make it even just a little bit more authentic? And I'm not saying they go out and they do a research study in the field of ecology, but what do ecologists do? What kind of questions do they ask? And does this assignment actually match that practice? And so I just want to encourage you to think a little bit about that. And then finally, their identity. Understand the value of biodiversity and the role students will play. That's an excellent point, and I think it's an excellent question. How students influence their environment, how pollution has changed it over time. So I think those are all really good examples. If I were to add a question, I always would add a question that connects the identity and the practice. Do you see yourself becoming an ecologist? What kind of features about or characteristics of yourself do you see in ecologists? Do you think you could contribute to this field? A few questions like that is all I would add there. But I thought overall they had a lot of really good ideas. And then this comes back to my same question of like, who actually is building biomes? And is this an authentic task that a practicing professional would actually do. So I just encourage you to think through that a little bit. They did a really nice job of summarizing, and then I thought they had a good point about talking about how understanding by design and parallel curriculum model are linked, and then a lot of UBD plays into parallel curriculum model, and it's almost like you just have to pull out the pieces. They already exist in those units, especially if you're a good teacher. They already exist. You're just thinking about it. And what I found is that a few of them just help me become more directed in my designing. So for example, the practice and the identity are the two pieces that I don't often do naturally. I don't often think about who uses this, how do they use it, how can I make it as authentic as possible, and then did I have my students reflect upon that. So those are the pieces, that's what I like about the parallel curriculum model, and that's how I think it helps me to think through the process a little bit more. But I do think you're right that a lot of good teachers just inherently do this, and we can see pieces of this already existing in our UBD framework. And then this is Team 3's work this week on families and relationships. And again, I would just ask for a little bit more detail here in terms of the core content. If you're talking about families and relationships, what questions are you asking? How are you sure you're addressing this? And then for the practice, they're assuming the role of a police officer, which is interesting. But I would also again ask, what kind of questions are you going to use to help them think about that role? What kind of questions do police officers ask? What makes police officers' jobs challenging? What kind of problems do they run into or do they encounter? And then for the connections, I see the connections. Once again, it's one of those things where I see the connection, but I just want to make sure that the students see the connection. So for example, it says here the family tree lesson. So it connects students with their ancestors. So then I want to know, do the students see those connections? And you might have to ask the students explicitly, how do you connect with your ancestors, or what kind of connection do you see? Do you share something? Like, where is the connection there? And then the next one, the cultural customs at the family festival, which is a super idea. It's really, really great. But then when they think about it, I want to see what connections are they making, cross-cultural connections or even within cultural connections. What kind of things are similar or different about the different cultures or family practices that they're seeing. And then we have the identity, and I want to see the actual question. So I know students are going to reflect, but what questions are you going to use to prompt that reflection, and how can we be sure that that's doing what we set out to do? So those are my comments there on Team 3's work. And then finally, I just wanted to take a few moments to talk a little bit about your discussion board. I love reading your discussions. I wish we had more time for discussions, and I actually wish we could do this in person, because I really think that an in-person discussion would be cool. You do a wonderful job of bringing in your own personal experiences, tying it with the reading, giving examples, and I like how it's become a little bit more discussion-based. Anyways, so from the discussions this week, so I have a printed copy again of the discussions, because I find it hard sometimes to read online all the time. Let's see, one of the things that I liked was that you talked about the importance of letting teachers control what kind of units they're using and how they're implementing them in the classroom. And I think that's a really smart idea, and I think by exposing, and this is my hope for the class, by exposing you to multiple unit structures, you'll be able to put together something that really works for you. Whether it's a conglomeration of PCM, UBD, and we're learning about ICM this week. We're also going to learn about, we're learning about CSM this week and ICM in the future. So there's a lot of different models, and I'm hoping that by the end you'll be able to come up with your own way of planning units. And we started with the most rigid, and we're working towards a little bit more fluid, which a lot of you mentioned here. I do agree that the UBD template is quite excessive, and but I do think that the backwards planning that most of you talked about is really important. And I agree that a lot of teachers need a choice. They need to know, like, I'm a very rigid person, I need this full structure, or I'm a little more fluid, I can deal with this inner flow and interchange of ideas here. Let's see what else. I think Allison talked about, she gave a great example of her experience in a gifted and talented program in elementary school. And it was fun to read about the connection and that she made for her experiences and how they designed a newscast. And it was a really, really good story, and how the students reflected and gave feedback on each other's work, which I thought was perfect. I would say that if you had to choose one of these curriculum, one of these parallels, that you wouldn't actually be doing the parallel curriculum model. So be careful if someone asks you to choose one of the four, because that doesn't exactly embody the spirit of parallel curriculum model, because it's really the integration. And perhaps my question wasn't quite worded correctly. Let's see. So then it was interesting also, though, how I thought different people picked different units or different structures, which I think further illustrates the diversity within the teaching profession, how some people do like and appreciate the fluidity within PCM, and some other people would prefer a more structured approach to lesson planning. Then in Roderick's post, he talked about how one of the teachers took a very rigid approach and achieved great success, and another teacher took a very authentic approach and perhaps didn't achieve quite as much success on the standardized assessments. And once again, and I think Kathy really hit upon this in the next post, I always wonder, it achieved enormous success in this one class at this time, and we don't know what happened in the future. So we don't know if those students were actually college or career ready. And then I also don't know what the other teacher was like. Sometimes when students are given great amount of freedom without enough structure, it backfires. And so thinking through what's the right balance for you and your students, and that I do believe I believe that the teachers are professionals, and they're going to make that call for their students. And most of the time, I think they have the best interest of their students and the awareness of their students in mind as they choose the path that they choose. I just don't want people to be afraid of trying authentic tasks and these choice-based opportunities. I don't know, this is one example. I don't know how common it is, and some of the research that I've seen it makes a difference. Drill and kill at least 2 to 3 weeks before the I-step. That's the most efficient way to get instruction across. But if you're more than 2 to 3 weeks away from the I-step, it is not the most efficient, and it doesn't create these long-term connections with students, so that you'll have to come back and reiterate it, and then you'll lose time that way. So I just want to make you aware that sometimes things work for people, and that's it's a single case in the midst of other cases. But I think that's a good point. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying be a little careful about generalizations. Then, let's see, and I agree completely that teachers should not have the models forced upon them, no matter what research or ideal situations show. Again, that comes back to the idea that I truly agree with Roderick that teachers need to have freedom in selecting the curriculum models they use and implement. And then I liked Catherine, who I think goes by Kathy. I liked how she talked about finding the right balance, and I think that's really important. I mean, when we talk about flipped classrooms, or we talk about simulations or differentiation, all of these things are really good. But do you want to do that every single day? Is there a place for integrating lectures with perhaps technology, with simulations, with differentiation? Absolutely. What we want to do is create an environment that fosters learning among all students. And one of the ways that we can do that is to integrate various components so that it's not all lecture-based. That might be effective for some students, but it may not be effective for all students. And so I think we need to think about this idea of balance and being okay with it not being all one way or the other. And I did talk a little bit about, Jamie brought up the idea of authentic performances, and Jamie is in a unique situation because she teaches so much younger students. She's a preschool teacher, so she's dealing with 3- and 4-year-olds. So it makes a lot of sense to me that she'd be concerned about or at least considering what an authentic performance would look like for a 3 or a 4-year-old. There definitely is not the same expectations as someone who is much older. And likewise, even people in middle school, I mean, we're not expecting them to become published scientists necessarily, but what we are expecting them to do is develop habits of mind that address the discipline the way a true professional would. And so even if we just ask 3 and 4-year-olds to start coming up with questions, that could be, I mean, other professors might argue with me on this, but I think that could be considered an authentic performance task because it's the process that scientists use. They develop questions. And so the 3 and 4-year-old questions aren't going to be the same as the actual practicing scientists, but it's the process. The process is the same. So, or at least it's at the developmental level. So that's just something I want you to consider. And I like the idea of using a mix of both models, and I think Jamie mentioned that also. I think that was a really good idea, and that's how I like to do it as well, because I like the backwards planning of UBD, but I also like the focus and emphasis on the identity parallel, which I don't see a lot of in UBD, and I also like the focus on the practice parallel. And I think connections are inherent within UBD because that's why we're coming up with these overarching concepts so that we can start to make those connections. Why boil down your unit to the idea of relationships if you're not going to take that to the next level and say, I see the relationship here with this habitat and this organism and how they affect each other, and then I can also see this relationship of how the different pieces of the water cycle affect each other. And so I'm seeing all these relationships in science, and that's really neat. And so I think UBD fosters this idea of connections, even though it may not emphasize it to the extent that parallel curriculum model does. So hopefully that gives you an overview of our discussion, and we talked a little bit about the good things and some of the things that we can improve upon, and I look forward to seeing your work in the future. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I might be a little slow responding with this week being in Philadelphia, but I will try to do my best. Thank you.